Hello, a very good evening. It's 7:04 on LBC. Welcome to Iain Dale in the evening on Monday. And this is the first of our Ring Rachel Reeves phone-in. She's going to be coming in once a month to take your call. She is obviously Labour's Shadow Chancellor. Rachel, welcome. Are you looking forward to facing the fire
with some
or the
trepidation
ire of the LBC listeners?
I always enjoy listening to LBC listeners and spending time with you, Iain. So what could possibly go wrong?
Enough greasing up. 0345 6060973. Lots of calls coming in already, but feel free to add to them. You can text your question to 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And you can watch us also on Global Player. Now, first question is from Liz in Norfolk, who wants to give her view on why it's so difficult to reform Britain's economy. Liz?
For more than 10 years, we've had relatively cheap money, low interest rates, relatively high government spending. And, there's been a variety of factors that have caused that. COVID is a good example, and relatively high taxes. And that has, but also not diverging from the EU, not doing some of the deregulatory stuff that might have got growth going more. So those attitudes were part of the system.
The left-wing economic establishment, which you're obviously part of.
Me and the bond traders. I mean, Liz Truss, I just find it unbelievable that she thinks that what the country wants is to hear more from her after the damage she did in the 49 days that she was
Did you read
Prime
her
Minister.
article?
I had a little look of it. I mean, 4,000 words is quite a long apology letter. Oh, but it didn't have an apology in it. I mean, I was with an estate agent last week on the day that the Bank of England. I do. I'm not buying a house, but I was talking to him about what was going on with mortgage rates at the moment and the impact that was having. And he said that mortgage approval, so new mortgages agreed, is at half the level it was a year ago. And he says, there are young people who have been saving up and their dream is to own their own place, not been able to because of what's happened to interest rates, couples who want to start a family but need to move to a bigger property to be able to have the space that they want for a family or a growing family. Their hopes and dreams being put on the back burner. A lot of that is down to the decisions of Liz Truss and her government. And I do find it astonishing that she's now coming back to justify it all. I mean, the one thing I guess it does reveal, though, her plan for growth utterly failed. But this government doesn't even have a plan for growth, and we're flatlining along the bottom. The world is being upgraded in its growth forecasts. The UK is being downgraded. It's a reminder that this government haven't got a plan for growth, but I certainly wouldn't want to go back to that.
Well, I guess the question which our listeners want the answer to is, have you? And hopefully that'll come out with some of the questions this evening.
I'll be very happy to talk about that.
I'm sure you will. Let's go to Tony, who is in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. Hello, Tony.
Good evening, Iain and Rachel. I've got a question, but I've also got a suggestion to answer my question, but I'll put the question through to you. How will a future Labour government retain and recruit staff for the public sector, such as nurses, carers, that type of thing?
Well, Tony, thanks very much for phoning. I think the first thing and most important thing, and it doesn't cost anything, is to show some respect. And I think that legislation that was passed a couple of weeks ago in Parliament, actually last Monday, to make it easier to sack nurses and other public sector workers was utterly counterproductive, because it just sends another signal to public sector workers that this government doesn't really value them. And a couple of years ago, we were all out on our doorsteps, banging pots and pans, clapping for nurses and other key workers. And now the government passes laws to make it easier to sack them. No wonder public sector workers are so angry with this government when they refuse to get around the negotiating table and talk, and then they pass legislation like this. Now, we've clearly got a big problem in our health service and in other public services around recruitment and retention as well. Now, Labour have put forward plans for the health service that we would get rid of the non-dom tax status, because if you make Britain your home, you should pay your taxes here. And we would use that to recruit a new generation of doctors and nurses, not doubling the number of training places at medical school, increasing the number of training places for nurses, for midwives, for district nurses too. So we've got a costed and funded plan to invest in our health service, while this government...
So how much would that raise to...
So that would raise about £3.5 billion.
Because the figure I saw today was 1.6 billion.
Well, this is numbers that are from the LSE and Warwick University using HMRC data that show you can raise about £3.5 billion by closing the non-dom tax loophole. So that's number using the government's own data. Now, the government themselves have said that they were looking at these numbers, but again, in Parliament last week, we asked them for the costings and how much they think they could raise from it, and they refused to tell us. But this is using HMRC data, so...
but that's not going to turn around the health service, is it? I mean, whether it's 1.6 or 3 billion, I mean, that's a pinprick in the grand total that's being spent over the next financial year, I think is somewhere between 160 and 170 billion. Now, if you're going to turn around the health service, yes, you need to recruit more people, you need to retain people, absolutely right. But it takes a lot more than that.
Oh, absolutely. You've got to have reform alongside investment.
And that will cost a lot more money. But what we don't hear from you is how much extra money you would put into the health service.
Well, the funding commitment that I've made is to scrap the non-dom tax status. And for example, it means that instead of 7,500 people training to be a doctor next year, it could be 15,000. And that could be the same the year after as well. So that would add up to an awful lot more people working in our health service. It would also be a clear statement to people who are working in the health service currently that the cavalry are coming. We understand the stress and the workload.
That's not reform, is it? Because
no, that's investment. So in terms of reform, we need to shift the support to helping people to stay in their homes for longer and to help get people out of hospitals back into their communities. So things like virtual wards, for example. That's why we've said that as part of our...
Why not real wards? Why not commit to reverse the cut in hospital beds that's been going on for 40 years?
Well, most people want to be in their own home, and it's the safest place to be, and it's where you can be surrounded by your friends and family and loved ones. And new technology and investment in district nurses will mean that more people can be treated at home, and also people can leave hospital. I was talking to the chief executive of the Health Trust in my constituency in Leeds just a few weeks ago. And he was saying around a third of beds are taken up by people who shouldn't be in hospital, but they can't go home, they can't go into a care home because there's not the care available in the community. That makes no sense at all, because the most expensive place to be is a hospital. But also, look, I think for most people, if you're in a hospital, you want to get out. You want to be at home. That's where you feel most comfortable. That's where you feel most safe. And so we need to shift that to help people stay at home. It will save money and it'll be better for patients as well.
Tony, I'm going to come back to you with your idea in just a moment. But before we do, obviously, let's tie in the strikes today in the NHS. Nurses out on strike, other workers as well. Does Labour support these strikes?
I totally understand why workers are on strike. Well, I don't want people to be out on strike. I don't say, oh, brilliant, strikes today, good on them. It's an utter failure when there are strikes.
You either support a strike or you don't.
No, I don't think it is like that, actually. I support nurses and I understand why they're taking action, but I do not want to see strikes because of the disruption that is occurring as a result of it. But it takes two to negotiate, and the government are refusing to get round the table. Now, there weren't strikes today in Wales because they've made an offer and that's going out to members. The leader of the nursing union before Christmas said that they would call off the strikes if Steve Barclay, the health secretary, just got round the table to negotiate. He refused to do that, and as a result, we had all that disruption. The government, even at this late stage, needs to get round to the negotiating table to help resolve this.
But there'll be a lot of your party members who think, why can't Rachel Reeves just say, yes, I do support these strikes, they're entirely justified, and the reason is because the government won't get round the table?
Because I just don't think that I don't want to say that I support strikes, because strikes are a sign of failure. If Labour were in government today, I would be doing everything in my power to avert strike action, and that means getting around the negotiating table. But I totally understand why public sector workers feel at the end of their tether, not just in the health service, but in our schools as well, that they've been so disrespected, so let down by the government, that they feel they have no alternative but to take this action. And I totally understand that.
Tony, you had an idea for Rachel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, we've got to stop losing staff. Bit of a conflict of interest here. I am a nurse myself. So could not a tax code be developed just for public sector workers called essential worker tax code? Just give them a bit of a break with the tax, and we might stop hemorrhaging nurses and carers and doctors, and ring fence it for public sector workers, not for agency staff like agency nurses and agency doctors who do make a pretty penny. That's my suggestion. Okay. I don't know if it could work.
There's instant policy there for you, Rachel.
Yeah. Well, Tony, first of all, thank you for everything that you do as a nurse to support your community. And I don't know whether you're taking industrial action at the moment, but I really hope that this dispute can be resolved in the best interests of people who work in the public sector, and also the patients who I know that you support day in, day out. Look, I've been very clear as Shadow Chancellor that I'm not going to make any spending commitment where I can't say where the money is going to come from. And obviously, any form of tax cut, you'd have to explain where the money was going to come from, which is why we have said we would get rid of the non-dom tax status, because we want that investment to go into nurses rather than in lower taxes for people who make their home here but don't live in the UK. But look, I want taxes on working people to be as low as possible. I think one of the problems over the last few years is that more and more of the income of working people is taken up by taxation, whether that's stealth taxes like freezing the thresholds for tax allowances, or the government's attempts last year to increase national insurance. The way to address all of these problems is to grow the economy. And what we've failed to get in the last 13 years under the Tories is economic growth. And we need growth to be able to invest in our schools and our hospitals and our police. Well, her growth plans were a load of deficit finance, tax cuts. And the problem with that is that nobody believed it was possible. And, far from it being the left-wing economics establishment that ruined her plans, it was investors who didn't have any faith in the UK government.
You can't go into the next election saying, well, we're essentially going to have the same kind of spending plans. We're not going to commit to more spending because that would be unaffordable, etc., etc. That's not going to get the voters out on a full Thursday in January, is it?
So if you look at what we've put forward, we've said that we would close the tax loophole around private equity. So private equity bosses pay income tax, not just capital gains. That there will be VAT and business rates on private school fees. That we would get rid of the non-dom tax status, and that we would invest in the industries of the future as part of our green prosperity plan. So a big difference between what Labour are offering and what the Tories are.
We'll come to more of your calls in just a moment. It's 16 minutes past 7.
This is LBC.
19 minutes past 7 on LBC. You're listening to Iain Dale in the evening with Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. She's going to be joining me once a month to take your calls. This is I was going to say her first run out. That sounds like a second-hand car, doesn't it? So I did say it, didn't I? Anyway, right, you can send in your questions by phoning 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. Our next question comes from Matthew in Liverpool. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Iain. Hello, Rachel. I have a question. Well, I'm actually a former Labour Party member, no longer party member. Long story. I'm not going to get onto it. We don't have the time. But anyway, my question was related to the dreaded B word, Brexit. So the question is as follows. So why is Labour so opposed currently to any form of customs union or single market re-entry? And how does the Labour quote-unquote Brexit, make Brexit work, differ from the Tory version? I just don't really see any difference. And is it just more slogans, prevarication, deflection? Because I am totally confused around how your version of Brexit will be different to the Tory version and what effectively we can negotiate with our partners in the EU, who we have been, let's face it, pissing off for the last, I'm not sure I can use that language, but annoying very vividly for the last 7 years. So maybe you can clarify how your version of Brexit in a bit more detail differs from the Make Brexit version of the Tory party.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your question, Matthew, and it'd be great to have you back in the Labour Party.
Doesn't sound as if he's got an intention of coming back yet, does it?
You never know.
Persuade him.
So, under Labour, we're not going to be going back into the single market customs union or bringing back the free movement of labour. But that doesn't mean that we think that the deal that the government has got and the way things are going are all fine and well at the moment. They're clearly not. The Bank of England, the Office of Budget Responsibility, any business, big or small, that you speak to knows that things are not working at the moment. And so we've said a number of things where we would like to get change in the British national interest. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So services make up more than 80% of our economy, and yet the Brexit deal that the Conservatives agreed had nothing in it for the service industry. We want to secure the mutual recognition of professional qualifications so that people who qualify in the UK can practice in Europe, for example. We want a veterinary agreement so that our great British farmers and fishermen can export their goods without a load of bureaucracy and red tape around Europe. And that would help other exporters as well, because it would reduce some of the backlogs at the border. And I guess most of all, Matthew, we do want to change the adversarial relationship that has developed over the last 7 years.
But hasn't that changed over the past few months? So if you look at what is said to be progress on the Northern Ireland Protocol, that is because of a change of attitude, isn't it?
I really hope that we get that agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, especially ahead of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April. But no, I still think that the government are acting like it's 2016 all over again and looking for fights always with the European Union rather than trying to...
What's the evidence for that? I could see what you could say that about Liz Truss's government, but I can't see the evidence in Rishi Sunak's government.
Well, it's a lack of cooperation on things that would help us. Well, Horizon, for example, the deal between universities that we're no longer part of. That's just cutting our nose off to spite our
That hasn't
face.
happened under Rishi Sunak. I mean,
we're doing
all of the mood music under his government, and OK, it's still a Tory government, but it is a different leader. The mood music now is far more cooperative with the EU, and we're seeing, I think, the evidence of that.
I really hope so on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but trade between the UK and Europe, the government are making no effort to make that easier. Now, all economists are saying, it's a 4% hit to our economy. 30% of small businesses are no longer exporting to the European Union. That's not good enough. The status quo is not working for the British economy. I want British businesses to be able to export all around the world, and at the moment they're being tied up in red tape.
Take Matthew's question head on, because let's transport ourselves back in time by a couple of years. You, Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, whoever, would be in this studio arguing that Britain should still be in the single market or the customs union. And now you've done a complete volte-face and you're arguing, no, we won't go back. If you believed it then, why don't you believe it now?
Well, I voted to remain in the European Union. I thought that was in our national interest. But almost 7 years have passed now. We are outside the single market and the customs union, and we have to forge a path outside. The last thing I want for our country is to restart the division that occurred during that referendum.
But if you believe coming out of the single market was so awful, if you believe coming out of the customs union has had bad effects, if you think that lack of freedom of movement has damaged our economy, why wouldn't you argue to go back into those or allow those?
Because those decisions have been made and we are now outside, and I don't think it would be good for our economy and for business if we started a whole load of protracted negotiations over a period of time. What I'm putting on the table and what Keir is putting on the table are practical things that could be done now to make it easier for British businesses to trade across the European Union. The status quo is not working. We want to improve on it, but I don't want to go back to the terrible division that we had in our country over many years through these negotiations.
Isn't the simple truth it's political expediency, because you know that you'll find it more difficult to win back those red wall seats if you don't have a sort of bit of a Eurosceptic line in your policy lineup?
No, it's a genuine belief, and from talking to businesses, that what they want are some of the practical changes that we've started to put on the table to make our trading relationship easier. And the idea that another 7 years of negotiations is going to serve our economy well, I just don't think it will. And it will open up the divisions, which I think did huge damage to us as a country, and I don't want to reopen them.
Matthew, thank you very much. Let's go to Michael in Rains Park. Michael, what's your question, please?
Hi, Iain. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Michael.
Now, I'm one of the 3 million self-employed that received no support during COVID, and then after COVID was hit by the changes that Rishi Sunak made to the IR35 framework when he was Chancellor. Now, you've made some sympathetic noises towards supporting the self-employed, but can I pin you down? Can I ask, if Labour win power next year, what will you do to support the self-employed? And specifically on the IR35 framework, will you scrap the changes that Rishi Sunak made there?
Hear, hear, he said impartially.
I do think that self-employed people were let down during the pandemic. You know, the government did a lot of good things with the furlough scheme, but there was a group of people who fell through the net. You know, on IR35, you know, we're looking at all of that. It is important, as somebody who wants to be in charge of the national finances, that I don't make any commitments to lose tax revenue or to make spending commitments without explaining where the money's going to come from, because that's the mess that the last Prime Minister, Liz Truss, got into, and look where that left us. But on things like business rates, for example, for small businesses who are starting up, I know that's not all self-employed people, but we want to reform the system of business rates to make it easier for small businesses to get started and get premises. So there are changes that we want to make it easier for people who are entrepreneurs, who are business people. We did a review as well last year, chaired by Lord Jim O'Neill, on how to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business, looking at reforms for access to finance for startups and for scale-up businesses. So there's lots of things where we're coming forward with ideas of how we can make Britain better for entrepreneurs and for self-employed people, because I think now self-employed people are something like 1 in 6 in our economy, and we need to ensure that you all have the opportunity to thrive and to grow your businesses and create the employment and the businesses of the future.
Just thank you very much, Michael. Going back to the last question on Brexit, someone's texted in saying, if there was another EU referendum today, how would you vote?
If we went back to 2016, I would vote the same way.
No, but if there was one today?
Well, there's just not going to be a referendum today. I don't think that starting another set of protracted negotiations would be in our economy's interest. But if we went back in time, I would vote the same way again. But I also recognise that the majority of people didn't have that view. And we've got to make what we have today work. And I want to do that.
Let's squeeze in Eric in Enfield just before the news. Eric, good evening. What would you like to ask Rachel?
Hi, good evening, guys. Good evening, Ian. Good evening, Rachel.
Hi, Eric.
Regretfully, I'm a ex-Labour voter. I'll never vote for you guys ever again. The only reason being is because of Sadiq Khan. And I want to know, what do you think of him introducing ULEZ in this terrible crisis we live in? People like me, which will be out of business, and hundreds of other people like me. You know, shouldn't he be delaying it, Rachel? Tell me, please.
I'm not a London MP, and so I've got to say...
These ULEZ zones, they're existing all around the country now, in Bath, Birmingham, Bradford, Bristol, Portsmouth, on Tyneside. Andy Burnham is going to set one up in Manchester as well, so it's not just a London issue.
Right, OK, well, I don't think they've got them in other areas of the country at the moment, and as a Leeds MP, we don't have anything like that as well. Look, I think it's a difficult balancing act. There are people, the number of excess deaths every year because of a lack of clean air, and you see that every day in London. You feel that every day in London, the air pollution. We've got to do something about that. We had that death of that young girl on the death certificate. It was about air pollution. So we can't just close our eyes and pretend everything is okay, because it's
when
not
you
today.
have Martin Lewis, who most people seem to think is a god on these things, when he says, if I may be honest, the reasons behind the ULEZ zone are good, but the timing is pretty tough to do it this year amongst a cost of living crisis.
I do understand that, and that's why I'm saying that if I was Chancellor today, I would be freezing energy prices, not allowing them to go up by £500.
But would you ask Sadiq Khan to delay it by a year, maybe?
Well, no, that is not my job, and I'm not a London MP. But I do understand why Sadiq wants to have clean air in London, because people are dying because of the pollution, the air pollution today. So we can't just stick with the status quo. But if I was in government today, we wouldn't be going ahead with a fuel duty increase, which will be the biggest ever increase in fuel duty in April, and we'd be freezing gas and electricity bills by expanding the windfall tax on the big energy giants, because I know and I understand the challenges that people are facing with the higher cost of living and wages not keeping pace. OK, more of your calls to come. 0345 6060 973. It's 7:32. Let's get the latest news headlines from Amelia Cox.
The death toll from a powerful earthquake which has hit Turkey and Syria is expected to surpass 3,000. A search and rescue team, as well as specialist equipment from the UK, is on the way to Turkey. A man who murdered a woman and her 2-year-old daughter has been jailed for at least 36 years. Andrew Innes had claimed a defence of diminished responsibility, but a jury took just 2.5 hours to convict him. And the Shadow Chancellor has told LBC she doesn't want to say she supports strikes because it's a sign of the failure by the government. Rachel Reeves says a Labour government would get round the negotiating table. LBC weather, some light rain in the northwest tonight, clear and cold in the south, a low of -3 degrees.
LBC
it.
25 minutes to 7 on LBC. Rachel Reeves is here, the Shadow Chancellor, answering your calls. Richard in Windsor says, "Dear Iain, great show. Please tell the Shadow Chancellor that I will give £1,000 to a charity of her choice if she doesn't mention the non-dom tax again this hour." Well, you've got 9 minutes you've got to go because we're finishing at 7:45. So do you reckon you can manage that?
He could give some money to Money Buddies in Leeds if he fancies it, but I will stop mentioning that tax when the government bring it in and ensure that those people pay their fair share. If you haven't been listening to the previous half an hour, you can...
Let's go to a slightly more challenging question from Hassan in Slough. Hassan, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Iain. Hi, Rachel. It was a delight to speak with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner when they presented on LBC. Just to be transparent, I'm a lifelong Tory since 1992, and I did vote for Rishi Sunak last July. Now, yourself and Keir Starmer, you always criticise Sunak and Jeremy Hunt and how they're handling the economy. So my question to you then is, what alternative would you propose? Because I haven't heard anything from Labour. Now, just now, you did actually talk about closing the tax loopholes and green energy. That's fine. But I'm talking about the big picture where you're turning the economy around and growing it.
Well, thanks very much for your question, Hassan. I think that there are huge possibilities in the UK economy. We could be global leaders in some of the industries of the future, from green technologies to life sciences to our great cultural industries. And yet we're not seizing those opportunities. And I guess that's what frustrates me the most, the gap between our potential and where we are today.
But we are in fintech, for example. We are world leaders.
But if you look at the numbers last week, the world was upgraded, the UK was downgraded. I don't want to be lagging against our competitors around the world. And that's why we've put forward our Green Prosperity Plan, our reforms to business rates, our plans to make Britain the best place to start and grow a business, because I'm hugely ambitious for the UK. And I know you've got to have growth if you want to do anything else, whether it is lifting living standards or having the money for our schools and our hospitals and our police. Now, look, I put forward loads of specifics. Our Green Prosperity Plan, for example, our reforms to business rates, but also our plans for this April, because at the moment, if the government do nothing, in less than 2 months' time, people's energy bills are going to go up by a further £500. That is not right. When we saw the results last week from Shell, £32 billion profit last year, the highest profit in its 115-year history.
That's worldwide profit.
Yes, and more than £3 billion of that profit was made in the UK, and yet they only paid £170 million worth of tax in the UK. They are making windfalls on the back of a war, and they should be paying more tax, and we should use that money. Well, we think that we could raise another £13 billion through the windfall tax, and we would use that money to freeze bills from April rather than see them go up by £500. Some money targeted towards businesses, because we know that small businesses and the most energy-intensive industries are struggling. And we also want to close that gap between people who are on prepayment meters, who are actually paying more for their energy, despite the fact often being the poorest in society. And we would ensure that there was one rate rather than one for those on prepayment meters and another for everyone else. Those are just some of the changes that Labour would make to address the immediate challenges, but also to grow our economy and end this sort of sticking plaster approach where we lurch from crisis to crisis, coming up with a fix, but not having the real plans to grow our economy or boost our own energy security.
Can I just follow up on the prepayment meters? Because I think everyone was rather shocked at the scandal last week, including, it seems, various government ministers and indeed the regulator, Ofgem. Now, Grant Shapps today said that the Ofgem had been asleep on the job, which I think was probably putting it kindly. Isn't it time to scrap Ofgem and start again? Because they have proved to be remarkably incompetent, not just on this, but on many other things too.
And it's time to scrap the government and start again, frankly, Iain, because...
Well, you can do that in a general election, but the government could actually say, no, this regulator isn't working, let's abolish it and bring in a new one.
Well, we've said, for example, that there should be a moratorium, and we've been saying this for ages, on the forced installation of prepayment meters. I knew about this as a constituency MP. A local charity in Leeds came to me and told me about these issues, and I've raised them. And... the government apparently had no idea that this was going on. The regulator, as you say, Iain, had no idea it was going on. If they don't want to do their job, they should give way to somebody who actually wants to.
But the companies themselves say they didn't know that it was going on, which I have to say I don't believe.
I don't believe it either, Iain. The idea that a journalist can sort of rock up for a couple of weeks and uncover all this sort of stuff, and the executive and the quality assurance people and all the people that these big energy companies employ had no idea what was going on. I mean, it does beggar belief.
Does.
But so there's two things that are needed. The forced imposition of the meters must end, but also it isn't right that if you're on a prepayment meter, often through no choice of your own, you shouldn't be paying more for your gas and electricity than, for example, you or me do. It can't be right that the poorest are paying some of the highest prices. That should end.
Right, Hassan, thank you. Let's go to Khaled in Wimbledon. Hello, Khaled.
Hi, Iain. Hi, Rachel. I'd just like to ask Rachel, a future Labour government, what taxes will you cut and what income tax bracket will you target?
Well, thanks very much for that question, Khaled. Look, the next general election is probably still almost 2 years away. We don't know what mess, frankly, we're going to inherit in terms of the economy or our public services. So I'm not going to make commitments here and now about what will be in our manifesto.
He's wanting to know sort of a direction of travel.
Well, he said, what would our income tax
and he wants to know which section of society, if you were going to put up taxes, would you hit? Who are you most likely to help?
So I want to help ordinary working people who are being clobbered with tax rises. There's been 22 Tory tax rises since the last general election. And time again, those tax rises fall on the ordinary working man and woman. I put forward the windfall tax, the tax on the non-doms. Sorry, I've mentioned it again.
You see, you've cheated that charity out of £1,000 now.
Oh, gosh.
This is fiscal irresponsibility writ large, isn't it?
That is. But I think it is important because the more we talk about it and the more the government come under pressure to do it, that would be £3.5 billion that we could use to invest in our National Health Service. So we do need to keep on going on about it. So we put forward some targeted tax increases and closing tax loopholes. But I would like to see taxes on ordinary working people lower because I know, especially right now, in the middle of this cost of living crisis, that people are struggling with the higher energy bills, the higher weekly food shop cost, and also the higher mortgage rates because of the Tory mortgage penalty after the mini budget last year.
Right, Khaled, thank you. Let's see if we can squeeze in two quick questions. The first is from Wamek in Ilford. Wamek, hello. What would you like to ask?
Hello, Iain. Hello, Rachel. My question is, how can Labour even think about putting tax on private school fees when people are already suffering from cost of living crisis?
It's a fair comment, isn't it? Because there are a lot of people who send their kids to private school who would not be regarded as rich. They're middle-income earners.
Well, you go into any state school today and you see the shortage of staff, the shortage of books, the school buildings that are in a state of disrepair, and politics is about choices. And private schools are many things, but I don't think that they are charities, and I don't see why you shouldn't pay VAT on sending your child to a private school in the same way that you pay VAT if you take your family out for a meal at the weekend.
How can you compare education with taking your family out for a meal?
Well, what I'm saying is that you're paying for a service, you're paying for something, and apart from food and children's books...
You're saying education is a luxury?
Well, I'm saying that there are state schools providing education, and if you're paying to go private, then you should be paying VAT in the same way that you do on a holiday, on a washing machine. A washing machine, most people wouldn't say that was a luxury, but you pay 20% VAT when you buy one. And so I think that should be the same for private schools. And we would use every penny of that money and put it into our state schools, because at the moment you've got more kids in large classes, more kids falling behind after the pandemic. Politics is about choices. And I would invest that money in all of our children in our state schools.
Wamek, thank you. Ray is in Weybridge. Hello, Ray.
Hello, good evening, Iain, and thank you for taking my call. Rachel, good evening. Got a
Good
couple
evening.
of questions for you. First off, you were born a day before Valentine and in the year of the child by the United Nations. Now, this is key. This Valentine's, lots of people are going to be sat at the table, not able to have fun or whatever because of the cost of living crisis. And children, and I say children, but I mean that in the youth, they're looking at the world and trying to figure out what's going on. Let me ask you a question. You came on today talking about non-dumb taxation, which only gives you $2 billion into the coffers, as you say. Why don't any government, but yours in waiting, go after the corporations that are not paying tax that is a known knowledge to people? Why don't they do that?
Right. Why don't they do that?
So we have said that we want the global minimum rate of corporation tax that President Biden initially proposed, and all of the advanced economies are supposed to be bringing it in this year. It's a minimum rate of 15%. Now, I would have liked to see it higher, closer to the rate of corporation tax that we've got in the UK. But because of that global agreement, it will mean for the first time that global multinationals who base themselves offshore for tax purposes will have to pay their corporation tax here in Britain. So I think that is a step in the right direction. I think that if you can afford to fly to space, you can afford to pay your taxes here on planet Earth. And under a Labour government, you will. And we also want a reform of the business rate system. So if you have a high street premises, if you're a small business, your burden of taxation would fall compared to those retailers who just sell online or use distribution centres. So we do want to see a fairer form of tax, whether that is business tax or whether it is paying your tax as an individual in this country if you live here.
We have covered a lot of ground today. We'll cover even more when you come back at the beginning of March. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. Hope you've enjoyed it.